A Shadowed Pages, welcome to you all from Shadowed Pages. I'm Edward, your host for tonight, and I'm so glad you've joined me. Tell me, where are you tuning in from, and how's your day been? I always enjoy hearing from you. Don't forget to subscribe so you never miss a new story. Now, let's begin the mystery. Miss Marple had chosen the corner table at the Silver Teacup Café because it allowed her to see everything without appearing to watch anything at all. The lace curtains softened the late morning light, giving the room a gentle, almost forgiving air, though Miss Marple knew better than to trust such impressions. Places that prided themselves on charm often concealed the most interesting human failings. The cafe was busy in the unremarkable way of a market town. Weekday. Cups clinked, a spoon scraped faintly against china, and Mrs. Hargreaves behind the counter moved with brisk competence, calling out orders in a voice that suggested kindness was her default setting, though irritation lay close beneath. Miss Marple sipped her tea slowly, her knitting resting untouched in her lap, her eyes drifting from table to table. At the center table sat Arthur Bellamy, solicitor, widower, and, if village gossip were to be believed, a man who had grown increasingly peculiar since his wife's death 2 years earlier. He was stirring his tea with unnecessary force, his gaze fixed on the dark liquid as though it might accuse him of something. Across from him sat his niece, Clara Bellamy, her posture stiff, her gloved hands folded carefully atop her handbag. She spoke in low tones, leaning forward, and Miss Marple noticed how Arthur flinched at certain words, though she could not hear them. Near the window, 2 ladies from the local horticultural society were engaged in earnest discussion, their conversation punctuated by disapproving glances toward the counter. Miss Marple suspected the subject was not begonias. Behind them, at a smaller table, Henry Pike, the journalist newly arrived from London, pretended to read the Gazette while listening far more intently to the room than to the printed page. Miss Marple approved of him cautiously. Journalists were much like village busybodies, only with deadlines. The bell above the cafe door gave a sharp jingle, and silence fell with surprising speed. Reverend Lionel Brooks stepped inside, removing his hat and offering a smile that did little to mask his unease. His eyes scanned the room before settling on Mrs. Hargreaves, who stiffened visibly. Miss Marple observed this with interest. There had been something odd about the Reverend of late. Something not unlike the strained cheerfulness of a man trying to outrun his own thoughts. "Good morning," he said, too brightly, and took a seat near the counter. Mrs. Hargreaves poured him tea without being asked. Her movements were efficient, but her mouth was set in a thin line. Miss Marple noted the way the Reverend avoided meeting her eyes. It was at precisely 11:20 that the scream occurred. It came from behind the counter, sharp and unmistakable, slicing through the gentle murmur of the cafe like a knife through sponge cake. Cups rattled. Chairs scraped. Mrs. Hargreaves staggered backward, one hand clutched to her chest, the other pointing toward the small door that led to the pantry. For a moment, no one moved. Then Arthur Bellamy was on his feet, his chair toppling behind him. Henry Pike folded his newspaper and followed closely, his expression alert rather than alarmed. Miss Marple rose more slowly, steadying herself with the table, her heart pounding though her face remained calm. The pantry was narrow and poorly lit, shelves lined with tins and jars. On the floor, between a sack of flour and the wall, lay Emily Rowe. Emily had worked at the Silver Teacup Café for nearly 10 years. She was quiet, efficient, and possessed of a smile that appeared only when she thought no one was looking. Now she lay on her side, her face unnaturally pale, eyes staring at nothing. A teacup lay shattered nearby, dark liquid spreading across the tiles like an ugly stain. Arthur Bellamy knelt beside her, his fingers trembling as he reached for her wrist. He withdrew his hand quickly, swallowing hard. "She's dead," he said, his voice barely audible. A gasp rippled through the small group gathered at the doorway. Mrs. Hargreaves let out a sob and sank into a chair, her apron twisted in her hands. Reverend Brooks crossed himself unconsciously, murmuring a prayer. Miss Marple leaned forward slightly, her sharp eyes taking in details others missed. The faint bruise at Emily's temple, the unnatural angle of her neck, the cup positioned too far from her hand to have simply fallen. Accidents, Miss Marple knew, had a way of explaining themselves. This did not. Henry Pike spoke first. "No one touch anything," he said gently but firmly. "We should send for the police." Arthur Bellamy nodded too quickly. Yes, of course." As someone hurried toward the telephone, Miss Marple returned to her table and sat down, her hands folded neatly in her lap. Around her, the cafe buzzed with frightened whispers, theories already beginning to form. Miss Marple listened, her mind working quietly, steadily, like a well-wound clock. Emily Rowe had not been the sort of woman people noticed, which, Miss Marple reflected, often meant she noticed everyone else. And someone, she was quite certain, had noticed Emily far too much. The arrival of the police altered the atmosphere of the Silver Teacup Café in subtle but unmistakable ways. The low murmur of speculation gave way to a constrained hush, as though the very walls had decided it was wiser to keep secrets. Inspector Harold Finch, a tall man with thinning hair and a habit of frowning even when pleased, surveyed the room with professional detachment. Behind him trailed a constable who looked barely old enough to shave and far too young to be, confronting death before lunchtime. Miss Marple watched as the inspector bent over Emily Rowe's body, his expression tightening. He asked a few brief questions of Arthur Bellamy, who answered with excessive precision, as though accuracy might shield him from suspicion. Mrs. Hargreaves was ushered into a chair and pressed a handkerchief to her eyes, her distress genuine enough, though Miss Marple noticed how quickly she recovered when Inspector Finch addressed her directly. Emily had gone into the pantry to fetch more teacups, Mrs. Hargreaves explained. She had heard a noise, something falling perhaps, and gone to see. That was when she screamed. No, she had not touched anything. No, Emily had not complained of feeling unwell that morning. Yes, she had seemed distracted lately, but then everyone had their worries. Inspector Finch nodded, jotting notes, his pen scratching with irritating insistence. He questioned the others in turn, establishing that no one had seen Emily enter the pantry, though several had seen her moments before behind the counter, wiping cups with methodical care. No one, it seemed, had seen anything at all. Miss Marple knew better than to volunteer information too early. She had learned, over the years, that policemen preferred facts to impressions, and impressions were her specialty. Still, she listened closely as the inspector questioned Reverend Brooks, whose hands would not quite keep still. The Reverend said he had arrived only minutes before the incident. He had spoken briefly with Mrs. Hargreaves about an upcoming charity luncheon. He had not gone near the pantry. His eyes flickered once, briefly, toward the counter, and Miss Marple stored the glance away. Henry Pike offered his account with calm efficiency. He had been reading the paper, he said, though his tone suggested he knew how little that would impress anyone. He had heard the scream, risen immediately, and followed Arthur Bellamy into the pantry. He had not touched the body. He asked politely whether the inspector believed it to be an accident. Inspector Finch did not answer him directly. Arthur Bellamy's turn came again. He stood apart from the others, his face gray, his hands clasped so tightly his knuckles shone white. He repeated that Emily had been a reliable employee, quiet, unassuming. He had no idea why she might have fallen. He did not mention the bruise. Miss Marple noticed that omission. When at last Inspector Finch's gaze fell upon her, Miss Marple offered him a small, apologetic smile. "And you, madam?" he asked. "Your name?" "Marple, Jane Marple," she said. "I was having tea." "And did you see anything unusual before the incident?" Miss Marple considered. "Unusual is such a relative term," she said gently. Emily seemed rather preoccupied, I thought. More than usual, that is. She dropped a saucer earlier. Quite unlike her. Inspector Finch made a note, his eyebrow lifting slightly. Anything else? Miss Marple shook her head. Only that accidents rarely leave bruises in curious places. The inspector looked up sharply. You noticed a bruise? Oh, yes, Miss Marple said. At the temple, and the cup, well, it seemed too far away. One would expect it nearer her hand if she'd simply fainted. Inspector Finch studied her for a long moment, then nodded slowly. Thank you, Miss Marple. The body was removed with quiet efficiency. The pantry door left ajar, its contents suddenly mundane and unsettling all at once. The cafe itself felt smaller, its charm dimmed by the knowledge of what had occurred within its walls. Inspector Finch instructed everyone to remain available for further questioning and departed, leaving behind a constable to keep watch. Gradually, people began to disperse, speaking in hushed tones as they stepped out into the daylight. Mrs. Hargreaves retreated behind the counter, her face set in grim determination, as though clinging to routine might restore order. Reverend Brooks lingered by the door, then left abruptly, forgetting his hat. Arthur Bellamy approached Miss Marple hesitantly. "You're very observant," he said, attempting a smile that did not reach his eyes. "I suppose village life sharpens one's senses." Miss Marple returned his look evenly. "It does tend to," she said. "People are always much the same, whether in villages or cities. Only the settings change." He nodded, as though unsure what she meant, and moved away. Left alone at her table, Miss Marple resumed her knitting, though her thoughts were far from idle. Emily Rowe had been frightened, she was certain of it. Frightened enough to be distracted, frightened enough to be silenced, and someone in that cafe, perhaps several someones, had known exactly what frightened her. Miss Marple's needles clicked softly as she worked, her expression mild. The first threads of the pattern were beginning to reveal themselves. By the following morning, the Silver Teacup Café stood closed, its windows dark and its door bearing a discreet notice citing unforeseen circumstances. The absence of its usual bustle left the street feeling oddly hollow, as though a familiar rhythm had been interrupted mid-beat. Miss Marple paused across the way, taking in the scene with quiet attention before continuing on her customary walk. She had not gone far when she encountered Mrs. Ellison, who lived 3 doors down from the cafe and possessed an almost professional interest in the affairs of others. Mrs. Ellison wasted no time with pleasantries. Emily Rowe, she announced, had been a most peculiar girl, keeping to herself, never marrying, and always leaving work precisely on time. There had been talk, she said, of letters, mysterious ones, and of Emily making frequent stops at the post office. Miss Marple listened politely, offering murmurs of agreement while mentally weighing the information. Letters suggested correspondence. Correspondence suggested secrets. Later that morning, Miss Marple received an unexpected visitor. Henry Pike appeared at her gate, hat in hand, his expression thoughtful rather than intrusive. He explained that Inspector Finch had mentioned her name and suggested she might be willing to share her impressions. Miss Marple invited him in, offered tea, and observed how his eyes roamed the sitting room, taking in details with practiced ease. Henry spoke first. Emily Rowe, he said, had not been entirely unknown to him. He had seen her several times in conversation with Arthur Bellamy, always in corners, always brief. He had thought nothing of it then. Now, in retrospect, he wondered. Miss Marple poured the tea carefully. "People often mistake discretion for insignificance," she said. "But those who observe quietly often see far more than those who speak loudly." Henry nodded. "Inspector Finch believes she may have discovered something. He's keeping an open mind." "As he should," Miss Marple replied. "Though open minds require careful guidance, or they wander." After Henry departed, Miss Marple sat for a time in silence. Emily and Arthur Bellamy. The image of them speaking in low tones returned to her, sharper now. Arthur's flinch, Clara Bellamy's stiff presence. Clara herself had been conspicuously absent from the cafe that morning, a fact Miss Marple found telling. In the afternoon, Miss Marple called upon Clara Bellamy under the pretense of offering condolences. Clara received her in a sitting room that was immaculate to the point of severity. She spoke warmly of Emily, praising her diligence and kindness, but her voice held an edge of impatience, as though the subject bored her. Miss Marple gently inquired about Emily's habits. Clara admitted that Emily had occasionally stayed late to help her uncle with documents. Legal work, she explained. Arthur trusted Emily. She was efficient and discreet. Discreet, Miss Marple echoed. Such a valuable quality. Clara's smile tightened. Yes, though sometimes discretion encourages curiosity. As Miss Marple took her leave, she noticed a stack of unopened letters on a side table, their envelopes unmarked by postmarks. Clara followed her gaze and quickly moved to cover them with a book. Outside, Miss Marple paused, her mind turning over the morning's conversations. Emily Rowe had been corresponding with someone. She had been meeting Arthur Bellamy privately. She had been frightened. That evening, Miss Marple returned to the Silver Teacup Café, or rather, to its locked door. Mrs. Hargreaves emerged from the back entrance, her expression weary but resolute. She greeted Miss Marple with a nod, and, after a moment's hesitation, invited her inside. The café smelled faintly of polish and cold tea. Mrs. Hargreaves confessed that Emily had come to her a week before her death, visibly upset. She had spoken of having found something she should not have, something that put her in danger. She had not been specific. She had only asked Mrs. Hargreaves to keep an eye out, just in case. Miss Marple listened intently. Did Emily mention any names? Mrs. Hargreaves shook her head. No, but she was afraid of Mr. Bellamy's niece. Said she was sharp, clever. Said she smiled too much. Miss Marple thanked her and left quietly, her thoughts coalescing into something more solid. Fear, letters, discretion, and a clever smile. The threads were tightening now, drawing closer together. Somewhere within them lay the truth of what had happened in the pantry, waiting patiently to be uncovered. The inquest was scheduled for the following afternoon, and the knowledge of it hung over the town like a low, persistent cloud. Miss Marple attended church that morning, less for spiritual necessity than for the opportunity it provided to observe her neighbors under the guise of solemn reflection. Reverend Brooks delivered his sermon with care, though his voice wavered at moments when it ought not to have done. Miss Marple noted how often his gaze strayed toward the Bellamy pew, where Arthur sat rigidly beside his niece. Clara Bellamy wore black, elegant and severe, her gloved hands folded with deliberate composure. Arthur, by contrast, seemed diminished, his shoulders stooped, his attention fixed on the floor. When the congregation rose to sing, Clara sang clearly, confidently, while Arthur's lips barely moved. Miss Marple had seen that particular contrast before, in marriages where one partner dominated the other with effortless precision. After the service, small groups formed outside the church, conversations subdued but eager. Miss Marple lingered just long enough to hear fragments. Speculation about the fall, whispered doubts about the bruise, an unkind remark about Emily's solitary habits. Clara Bellamy accepted condolences with gracious efficiency, steering Arthur away from anyone who lingered too long. Miss Marple walked home slowly, her thoughts busy. The letters Mrs. Ellison had mentioned returned to her mind, as did the unopened envelopes she had glimpsed in Clara's sitting room. Letters without postmarks suggested private delivery. Hand-delivered messages implied discretion and urgency. That afternoon, Henry Pike sought her out again, this time with a notebook openly in hand. He had spoken with the postmistress, he said, who confirmed that Emily Rowe had collected letters regularly, always from the same individual. She would not say who, citing privacy, but she had noticed Emily's nervousness increase in recent weeks. Miss Marple thanked him. "Nervousness is often the first sign of conscience at work," she said, "or fear of someone else's." Henry hesitated. "There's something else. Inspector Finch has had the pantry examined more closely. No sign of poisoning. The blow to the head was deliberate, but the fall broke her neck." Miss Marple absorbed this calmly. A staged accident, then, or at least an attempt at one. Someone had relied upon the pantry's cramped space, the scattered crockery, the inevitability of confusion. As evening drew in, Miss Marple paid a call upon Reverend Brooks, ostensibly to discuss arrangements for the church fete. He welcomed her with a strained smile, ushering her into a modest sitting room that smelled faintly of pipe tobacco and polish. She spoke lightly at first, then allowed a pause to stretch until the Reverend filled it himself. Emily Rowe, he said suddenly, had come to him for advice not long ago. She had been troubled, uncertain whether to act upon information she had come across accidentally. He would not say what it was. Confidentiality, he explained, bound him. Miss Marple regarded him gently. "Confidentiality is a great burden," she said, "especially when silence may do harm." The Reverend's hands twisted together. "I advised caution," he said. "I told her to think carefully before involving herself." "And did she?" Miss Marple asked. He did not answer directly. Instead, he spoke of regret, of wishing he had insisted she speak to the authorities. His voice broke, and Miss Marple believed his remorse to be sincere, though sincerity did not preclude weakness. When she left, dusk had settled over the town. Lights glowed behind drawn curtains, each window a private stage upon which dramas played unseen. Miss Marple returned home and settled into her armchair, knitting abandoned in favor of quiet thought. Emily Rowe had discovered something through her work. Documents, perhaps, or correspondence entrusted to her care. Arthur Bellamy's legal papers offered ample opportunity. Emily's discretion had been tested, her conscience awakened. She had sought counsel, hinted at danger, and continued to receive letters urging or threatening her into silence. Clara Bellamy, sharp and clever, had much to lose. Arthur's estate, his reputation, perhaps even his freedom. Miss Marple recalled Clara's remark. Discretion encourages curiosity. Spoken lightly, perhaps, but revealing nonetheless. Late that night, a knock sounded at Miss Marple's door. It was Arthur Bellamy, alone, his coat unbuttoned, his eyes red-rimmed and desperate. He asked if he might come in, his voice barely above a whisper. Once seated, he confessed haltingly that Emily had confronted him days before her death. She had discovered irregularities in certain documents, alterations made after signatures, discrepancies that pointed not to him, he insisted, but to his niece. Emily had threatened to go to the police unless matters were set right. "I was afraid," Arthur said. "Not of exposure, but of Clara. She has always been determined." Miss Marple listened without interruption. When he finished, she nodded slowly. "Fear makes accomplices of the innocent," she said gently, "but it does not make murderers of them." Arthur bowed his head, tears slipping down his cheeks. Outside, the town lay silent, unaware that one more secret had been spoken aloud, drawing the truth ever closer to the light. The morning of the inquest arrived gray and airless, as though the town itself were holding its breath. Miss Marple dressed with particular care, choosing a hat that suggested harmless propriety rather than intent, and walked to the small municipal hall where the proceedings were to be held. The room was already filling when she arrived, the benches crowded with familiar faces arranged in unfamiliar solemnity. Inspector Finch stood near the front, conferring quietly with the coroner. Clara Bellamy entered moments later, composed and impeccably dressed, her expression suitably grave. Arthur followed at a distance, moving as though each step required conscious effort. Miss Marple watched the space between them, noting how it seemed to widen with every passing moment. The inquest unfolded with procedural restraint. Medical facts were presented plainly: the blow to the head, the fatal fall, the absence of poison. An unfortunate accident was suggested, though the phrasing lacked conviction. When witnesses were called, Mrs. Hargreaves spoke tearfully, Reverend Brooks with evident remorse, and Henry Pike with measured clarity that drew a faint frown from Inspector Finch. Arthur's testimony was halting but earnest. He spoke of Emily's reliability, her trustworthiness, his regret that he had not taken her concerns more seriously. Clara's turn came last. She rose smoothly, her voice calm and controlled. She denied any knowledge of irregular documents, dismissed the notion of private letters as fanciful, and spoke of Emily with a distant kindness that struck Miss Marple as rehearsed. When questioned about the pantry, she said she had not gone near it that morning, that she had been seated at the table by the window until the scream. Miss Marple noticed Inspector Finch's pen pause briefly. The coroner adjourned without delivering a definitive verdict, leaving the matter unresolved, suspended in a limbo that satisfied no one. As the room emptied, Clara moved quickly toward the door, but Inspector Finch intercepted her with polite firmness. Miss Marple did not linger to hear their exchange. She already knew enough to anticipate its direction. That afternoon, Henry Pike appeared once more at Miss Marple's cottage, his usual composure strained by excitement. Inspector Finch, he said, had obtained a warrant to examine Arthur Bellamy's office. Several documents had been found that bore signs of alteration, ink mismatches, overwritten figures. More importantly, a bundle of letters had been discovered in a locked drawer, written in Emily Rowe's careful hand, addressed not to Arthur, but to Clara. Miss Marple nodded. Then Emily was not merely threatened, she said. She was negotiating. Henry frowned. Negotiating. Trying to set matters right without destroying Arthur, Miss Marple replied. A very human impulse. By early evening, Clara Bellamy was summoned to the police station. She arrived with her composure intact, but it began to crack under the steady accumulation of facts. She denied forging documents until confronted with the letters. She claimed Emily had been blackmailing her until Inspector Finch pointed out the dates, the increasing desperation in Emily's tone, the absence of any demands for money. At last, Clara's control slipped. She admitted altering the documents. Small changes, she insisted, meant to secure what she believed she deserved. Arthur, she said bitterly, was weak, indecisive. The estate would have been squandered without her intervention. Emily had discovered the alterations while filing papers and had threatened to expose her unless everything was corrected. And the pantry? Inspector Finch asked quietly. Clara's silence stretched too long. When she spoke, her voice was flat. She said she had only meant to frighten Emily, to make her understand the consequences of meddling. There had been an argument, a struggle. Emily had fallen. Panic had done the rest. By the time Miss Marple learned of Clara's arrest, the town was already alive with the news, speculation racing ahead of confirmation. She received word later that night when Inspector Finch himself called upon her, his expression a mixture of relief and rueful admiration. "You were right," he said, "about all of it." Miss Marple smiled mildly. "Not all," she said, "only about people." The following days passed quietly. The Silver Teacup Café reopened, its atmosphere subdued but resilient. Mrs. Hargreaves placed a small vase of flowers on the counter where Emily had once stood. Arthur Bellamy withdrew from public view, his grief compounded by guilt, though Miss Marple believed time would soften it. One afternoon, as Miss Marple sat once more at her corner table, Henry Pike joined her, notebook closed at last. "Do you ever wish," he asked, "that you hadn't seen so clearly?" Miss Marple stirred her tea thoughtfully. "Seeing clearly is not the burden," she said. knowing when to speak is. Outside, the town resumed its rhythms, secrets laid bare and absorbed into memory. Life, as ever, went on, carrying with it the quiet lessons learned too late by some, but not, Miss Marple hoped, by all. Although Clara Bellamy's arrest had satisfied the town's appetite for certainty, it did not still the undercurrent of unease that lingered beneath daily life. Truth, Miss Marple knew, was rarely as tidy as an arrest suggested. It seeped, leaving stains long after the source was removed. Arthur Bellamy remained secluded, his house drawn tight against visitors and curiosity alike. Miss Marple called upon him 3 days after the arrest, bearing a small basket of preserves, an offering both neighborly and unremarkable. He received her in his study, a room that smelled faintly of leather and old paper, its orderliness now tinged with neglect. He looked older than he had only a week earlier, his face slackened by exhaustion. He thanked her with quiet formality and gestured for her to sit. For a moment, neither spoke. Then Arthur began, his voice subdued as though confession itself had worn him thin. Emily, he said, had not simply discovered the altered documents. She had traced them. She had noticed patterns, dates that coincided with Clara's absences, handwriting inconsistencies that Arthur himself had overlooked out of trust or fatigue. Emily had come to him frightened but determined, urging him to look more closely. He had promised to do so and failed her by hesitating. "I thought I could handle it privately," Arthur said. "I thought I could persuade Clara to undo what she'd done." Miss Marple listened without interruption. She knew that delay, born of love or fear, often proved more dangerous than action. Arthur continued. Clara had grown increasingly volatile in the days before Emily's death. She had intercepted at least one of Emily's letters. Arthur suspected it, but could not prove it. When Emily disappeared into the pantry that morning, Arthur had assumed nothing more than routine. The scream had shattered that illusion forever. "I see now," Arthur said quietly, "that my silence made me complicit. Not legally, perhaps, but morally." Miss Marple regarded him with sympathy that did not excuse. "Silence," she said, "is often chosen to preserve peace. But peace built on falsehood is remarkably fragile." When she left, Arthur thanked her again, though gratitude seemed beside the point. Outside, the afternoon light slanted gently across the garden, indifferent to human reckoning. Inspector Finch sought Miss Marple out later that week, requesting her opinion on a matter that troubled him. Clara Bellamy, it appeared, maintained that Emily's death had been accidental, that the blow had been struck in panic, not intent. "She insists she never meant to kill her," Finch said, pacing slightly as he spoke. "Legally, intent will matter." Miss Marple considered this. "People rarely intend consequences," she said. "They intend actions. The rest follows." Finch sighed. "The letters, Emily never demanded money. She wanted the documents corrected." "A dangerous request," Miss Marple replied. "It threatened not just Clara's inheritance, but her sense of control." The inspector nodded slowly. "You think that was enough?" "For someone like Clara," Miss Marple said, "yes." Meanwhile, Henry Pike's article appeared in the Gazette, restrained but incisive. He wrote not of scandal, but of warning, how small deceptions grew dangerous when protected by familiarity and trust. The town read it carefully, some with indignation, others with quiet recognition. The Silver Teacup Café regained its patrons, though conversations there had softened, as if voices feared repeating past mistakes. Mrs. Hargreaves worked with resolute efficiency. Her kindness sharpened, now by wariness. She spoke of Emily less often, but when she did, it was with a tenderness that suggested ongoing dialogue rather than closure. One afternoon, Miss Marple noticed Reverend Brooks watching her from across the street. He approached with visible hesitation, his usual composure replaced by something closer to humility. He confessed that Emily had told him more than he had admitted earlier. Not specifics, but her fear that confronting Clara directly might provoke violence. "I advised caution," he said again, quieter now. "I told her to wait." Miss Marple met his gaze steadily. "Waiting," she said, "is advice that ages poorly." The Reverend bowed his head. "I see that now." That evening, Miss Marple returned to her sitting room and sorted through her thoughts as carefully as she sorted her sewing. Emily Rowe had tried to do the right thing in the least destructive way she knew. Clara Bellamy had tried to secure what she believed owed to her, mistaking entitlement for justice. Arthur Bellamy had tried to preserve family peace at the cost of truth. None of it, Miss Marple reflected, was unusual. Tragedy rarely required monstrous motives, only ordinary ones pursued too far. As dusk settled, the town lights flickered on, each window glowing with its own version of safety. Miss Marple sat quietly, aware that resolution was approaching but not yet complete. Justice, like truth, demanded patience, and patience, she had learned, was often the most difficult virtue of all. The days lengthened toward the preliminary hearing, and with them came a subtle shift in the town's mood. Certainty had hardened into judgment, and judgment into a quieter, more personal reckoning. Miss Marple sensed it everywhere. In the way conversations trailed off when she entered a room, in the careful politeness extended to Arthur Bellamy when he was finally seen walking again along the high street. Clara Bellamy remained in custody, awaiting formal charges. Reports filtered back through Inspector Finch with cautious restraint. Clara spoke little now, conserving her words as she once conserved her advantages. When she did speak, it was to insist upon her fear, her panic, her conviction that Emily had forced her hand. Miss Marple was not surprised. Those accustomed to control rarely relinquished the narrative easily. Arthur, by contrast, had begun to unravel his silence. He visited Miss Marple one afternoon unannounced, his manner subdued but resolute. He brought with him a folder of documents. Copies, he explained, of everything Emily had uncovered and everything Clara had altered. He placed them carefully on the table between them, as though setting down a burden. "I should have looked sooner," he said. "I should have trusted Emily." Miss Marple examined the papers briefly, though the truth they contained was already familiar to her. "You trusted her enough to fear for her," she said gently. "That is not nothing." Arthur shook his head. It was not enough. No, Miss Marple thought, but few things ever were. As he left, she watched him go with quiet concern. Guilt, she knew, could be as corrosive as malice if left unattended. Yet Arthur's remorse carried with it the possibility of repair, however limited. Later that week, Miss Marple encountered Henry Pike at the edge of the common. He had come not as a journalist, but as a man uneasy with his own role. The story had brought him attention, credibility. It had also brought him sleepless nights. "I keep thinking about Emily," he said, "about what she must have felt, knowing she was right and knowing it might cost her." Miss Marple nodded. "Doing the right thing is often lonely," she said, "particularly when it threatens the comfortable arrangements of others." Henry hesitated. "Do you think justice will be enough?" Miss Marple considered this. "Justice," she said, "is a framework. Meaning must be supplied by those who live with its outcome." The preliminary hearing was held quietly, without the spectacle some had anticipated. Evidence was presented. Statements were read. Clara Bellamy sat impassive, her gaze fixed straight ahead. When Arthur spoke, his voice trembled only once, when he described Emily's determination to correct the record without destroying his life. Miss Marple watched Clara closely then and saw, fleetingly, something like irritation cross her face, not sorrow, but frustration at loyalty misplaced. Afterward, the town seemed to exhale. Decisions were now in motion, beyond speculation, beyond gossip. Responsibility had shifted to institutions, where it would be weighed and measured according to law. Miss Marple returned home that evening to find a letter waiting. It was from Mrs. Hargreaves, written in careful, looping script. She wrote of the cafe, of how Emily's absence still echoed in small ways, in the placement of cups, in habits unconsciously preserved. She thanked Miss Marple, not for solving anything, but for listening. Miss Marple folded the letter thoughtfully. Listening, she reflected, was often the first step toward truth, and sometimes the last kindness one could offer. As night settled, she sat by her window, the familiar sounds of the town drifting upward, footsteps, distant voices, the closing of doors. Life had resumed its patterns, altered but intact, and somewhere within those patterns, lessons lingered, fragile but present, waiting to be remembered when next temptation or fear arose. Autumn arrived quietly, cooling the air and muting the colors of the town as though nature itself were softening the edges of recent events. The case against Clara Bellamy moved steadily forward, no longer the subject of open debate, but of subdued acknowledgement. People spoke of it less often now, yet when they did, it was with a seriousness that suggested the matter had settled into their collective conscience. Miss Marple noticed the change most clearly in small interactions. The postmistress, once brisk and talkative, now handled letters with an almost reverent care. Shopkeepers paused before repeating rumors, choosing instead to comment on the weather or the quality of produce. It was not forgetfulness at work, but restraint. Arthur Bellamy had returned cautiously to his professional duties. His office windows were open now, letting in light and air, and Miss Marple observed him more than once standing at his desk, long after business hours, papers spread before him as though order itself required constant vigilance. When she encountered him on the street, he greeted her with sincere warmth, tinged with something like humility. "I've amended my will," he told her once, as they walked together a short distance. "Transparency from now on. No private arrangements, everything above board." Miss Marple approved quietly. Reform born of fear rarely lasted, but reform born of understanding sometimes did. Reverend Brooks, too, had changed. His sermons grew less cautious, more direct, touching gently but unmistakably on responsibility and moral courage. Congregants listened with new attentiveness. Miss Marple thought of Emily Rowe then, of how her quiet integrity had rippled outward, altering lives she would never see changed. Henry Pike prepared to leave the town, his assignment complete. He visited Miss Marple one final time, less restless now, his curiosity tempered by experience. He spoke of returning to London, of other stories waiting to be told. "But I don't think any will stay with me quite like this," he admitted. Miss Marple smiled. "That is as it should be," she said. "Some truths are not meant to be forgotten quickly." The trial date was set. It would not be swift, nor would it be dramatic. Clara Bellamy's defense rested upon fear and provocation, upon the assertion that Emily Rowe had overstepped, had threatened ruin. The prosecution countered with letters, documents, timelines. Facts accumulated patiently, resistant to interpretation. Miss Marple did not attend the trial. She had learned long ago that her role lay not in courtrooms, but in kitchens, cafes, and sitting rooms, in the quiet spaces where people revealed themselves without realizing it. Still, she followed the proceedings through reports, noting how Clara's composure faltered under sustained scrutiny, how her narrative narrowed until it could no longer contain the truth. One afternoon, Mrs. Hargreaves came to see her, bringing with her a small parcel wrapped in brown paper. Inside was a teacup, one of the Silver Teacup Café's originals, repaired carefully at the handle. "It was Emily's favorite," Mrs. Hargreaves said. "She always said it felt right in the hand." Miss Marple accepted it with gratitude, touched by the gesture. Objects, she knew, carried memory more faithfully than words. As the trial progressed, the town waited. not with eagerness, but with a sober patience earned through discomfort. When the verdict finally came, it was neither shocking nor entirely satisfying. Clara Bellamy was found guilty of manslaughter, her actions deemed reckless, her intent undeniable even if not premeditated. Sentence was passed accordingly. There were no cheers, no gasps, only a quiet acknowledgement that something had reached its end. Miss Marple sat that evening by her fire, the repaired teacup resting on the table beside her. She reflected on the fragile chain of choices that had led to that pantry floor: ambition unchecked, silence chosen over honesty, fear allowed to dictate action. Emily Rowe had not sought heroism, she had sought fairness. That, Miss Marple thought, was often enough to place one in danger. Outside, leaves rustled along the pavement, gathering in corners before being swept away. The town would continue, as towns always did, reshaped subtly by what it had endured. And Miss Marple, knitting once more in her familiar chair, allowed herself a moment of quiet satisfaction, not in the outcome, but in the understanding that truth, however delayed, had found its voice. Winter arrived with a clean sharpness that seemed to reset the town, frost tracing delicate patterns along windows and hedges. With the trial concluded and Clara Bellamy removed from the daily consciousness of village life, a quieter reckoning settled in her absence. Justice had spoken, but understanding, Miss Marple knew, took longer to find its place. Arthur Bellamy called upon her one clear morning. His manner changed yet again. There was steadiness in him now, not the brittle composure of earlier weeks nor the collapse that had followed Emily's death, but something more durable. He spoke of reorganizing his affairs, of relinquishing sole authority in matters where secrecy had once seemed prudent. "I mistook privacy for protection," he said. "Emily understood the difference better than I did." Miss Marple listened, her expression kind but attentive. "Many people do," she replied. "Privacy hides things. Protection requires light." Arthur lingered, then produced a small envelope. Inside was a modest sum, earmarked for a local scholarship in Emily Rowe's name. Something practical, he explained. Something she would have approved of. Miss Marple thought it fitting. Emily had been practical to the end. When he left, Miss Marple stood for a time at her window, watching his retreating figure. She felt no triumph, only a sober completion, as one felt after finishing a difficult piece of mending. The fabric would never be quite the same, but it would hold. The Silver Teacup Café marked the season quietly. Mrs. Hargreaves added a small plaque near the counter, unobtrusive but deliberate. Emily's name rested there without flourish, integrated into the life of the place she had known so well. Customers noticed it, paused, then carried on. Memory, Miss Marple reflected, did not demand ceremony, only acknowledgement. One afternoon, Inspector Finch joined Miss Marple for tea. He looked less burdened than when the case had begun, though the lines around his eyes suggested lessons learned rather than weight lifted. "You were right," he said, stirring his cup thoughtfully. "About motive, about timing, even about the pantry." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "People behave most honestly when they think no one is watching," she said, "and most dangerously when they think they are." Finch nodded. Clara Bellamy never thought Emily capable of defiance. That was her mistake. "Underestimating quiet people is a common error," Miss Marple replied. "They have more time to think." The inspector hesitated. "Do you think Emily knew how much danger she was in?" Miss Marple considered carefully. "I think she knew enough," she said. "Enough to be afraid, not enough to stop." Finch accepted this in silence. As winter deepened, Henry Pike sent a letter from London. He wrote not of success, but of perspective, of how the story had altered his understanding of consequence. He thanked Miss Marple for her patience, her questions, her refusal to simplify what had been complex. She folded the letter and placed it beside others, content to let it rest. On a quiet evening not long before Christmas, Miss Marple sat alone with the repaired teacup Mrs. Hargreaves had given her. She poured tea slowly, savoring the ritual. The cup fit her hand well, balanced and familiar. She thought of Emily, of her careful habits, her measured courage. The final truth, Miss Marple reflected, had not been hidden in forged documents or intercepted letters, but in the nature of the people involved. Clara Bellamy's crime had not begun in the pantry. It had begun years earlier, in small choices made without challenge, in entitlement mistaken for necessity. Emily Rowe had disrupted that pattern, not through confrontation alone, but through persistence, through the steady insistence that things be made right. And Arthur Bellamy, for all his decency, had learned too late that neutrality in the face of wrongdoing carried its own weight. Miss Marple rose and extinguished the lamp, leaving the room in gentle shadow. Outside, the town lay quiet beneath the stars, its secrets fewer now, its conscience stirred. The Silver Teacup Café would open again in the morning. People would gather, talk, disagree, forgive. Life would continue, shaped subtly by what it had endured. As she prepared for bed, Miss Marple felt no desire for further involvement, no lingering questions tugging at her thoughts. The pattern had been completed. The final stitch held. Truth, she knew, did not always arrive dramatically. Sometimes it came softly, through observation and patience, through listening when others spoke too freely or not enough at all. And when it did arrive, it rarely offered comfort, but it did offer clarity. Miss Marple found that, in the end, clarity was enough.